Hello. Alright, so what we have here are two things that most people seem to want in their life, or want some permutation or different term for this in their life. And those are intentionality and authenticity. So, intentionality is largely your ability to enact or your ability to be directed and move towards something you want, largely a function of agency, and your goal is to become a subject instead of an object and act upon the world in such a way that reflects your desires and or is informed by your desires. The second is authenticity, which largely has to do with having a consistent identity or being consistent with one's identity, or to be, quote, real, or something to that effect is the way it's often characterized. And both of these seem like worthwhile aims, but one of the problems is that doing them both at the same time, they can come into conflict, specifically in the area of enacting change. So, if you're just changing your behavior, then agency seems to think, or sorry, then intent seems to think that's okay. But if what you're doing is you're changing your identity, there are certain schools of thought which would think that that is being inauthentic, or doing something that's inconsistent with your identity, a behavior that's inconsistent with your identity, is inauthentic. So this is the struggle: is how do we both be intentional in the way we are, and also be authentic to who we are, especially at times where what our intent is to do is to change who we are and to become a better person. How do we do that authentically? First, let's take a quick look at why we should be both intentional and authentic. For intentionality, it's largely a function of avoiding just floating through your life. You want to have direction and purpose. We're not going to get too deep into what intentionality is, but having a control over your life in the sense that your life is a function of your actions and not just feeling like your life is acting upon you and you're just alienated from the entire experience. So you want to exercise your will. Authenticity, largely, you want to be authentic as a function of social responsibility, being the I'm uncertain authenticity exists in an environment where there's no social interaction, like if you're in the wilderness somewhere. It involves being truthful, being the person who other people think you are, and what this gives you is largely a sense of coherence and continuity. Your and which is Coherence and continuity are helpful in a lot of ways. Your habits are a function of who you think you are. Your The way you approach problems can be informed by your identity. It simplifies things because you just need to consult who you think you are, and it's a shortcut for getting the types of actions you want out. And identity is really also largely contingent upon different models, and there's a lot of different ways to model identity. Without going too in depth, you have the looking glass self, which is identity is a function of how you think other people look at you. You have archetypes, something of Jungian or what's it called? The like ENTP, INTP type stuff. Myers Briggs, where your set of characteristics, also the psychology characteristics, and dichotomies like being conscientious versus being, what's the other one? Confrontational, something like that. Then there's bundle theory, which is that we don't have a solid identity, and what identity is just a function of little bits of characteristics that slowly are replaced over time. Like, there is no pearl inside the oyster that is us, that is fundamentally what we are, and instead it's just like a bundle of sticks, and the the sticks get replaced, and those characterize identity. I'm not going to go over all these, but the model is going to inform to what extent certain behaviors feel inauthentic or authentic. So let's get back to talking about change, because this is where these two come to a head, is when you're trying to change who you are by being intentional or changing your behavior in a way that seems inconsistent with what you think your identity is. So the perspective of trying to behave with high intentionality is to focus on the outcomes you're getting, and the perspective of trying to be authentic is to focus on the process. So the process is trying to be consistent with who you are, regardless of what you think is going to come out, and then being intentional is you're trying to get a certain outcome. And the question is these seem like two different processes, and how do we synthesize or reconcile them in a way that allows us to try and be intentional with who we are, be intentional with our identity, without being inauthentic. And I think the bridge for that is to focus on values. And by focusing on values, you can help bring both intent closer to authenticity and also authenticity closer to intent. So if your intent is to be consistent with your values, now that's closer to being a process than a specific outcome, right? So the behavior is similar to authenticity oriented behavior. And authenticity, bringing it closer to values, is a little bit trickier, and it's contingent on how you evaluate identity. Depending on how you look at what identity is, it's going to be more or less flexible. If you have a more flexible model for identity, what you can do is you can choose your process with intentionality. Choose decide what your values are, if you think you can decide your values. If your model doesn't allow you to decide your values, then you obviously can't do this. And my impression is that such models are not good models, but what works, works. So there are a few exercises you can do for working on values. You can do eliciting values. There's to try and figure out what your values are. One I like a lot is an ecology check. So this is from NLP, anytime you have a behavior that you want to engage in and it's consistent with your values and you feel intense internal resistance to doing it, one thing you can do is you could ask yourself, well, just assume, sorry, what you do is you just assume that whatever part of you is resistant to this has some sort of positive intent. And then you ask that part, what is the positive intent behind this behavior or this resistance? And you try and make sure that there's no other parts of your values that you're violating. And in doing this, you can try and be more consistent with your values. And as far as authenticity and intention goes, both of these are bringing your attention closer to your values. Okay, so values are the bridge between these two. I feel like there's something else I want to say, but I'm not entirely sure. You can be intentional with always trying to get closer and closer to your values, and also what your values are as a function of your identity is not, they're always more of a signpost than they are who you think you are actualized at this moment. When you have your identity as you think it is, and you think that some behavior is outside of your identity, and because of that you don't have access to it, what that ends up happening is it shuts you off from that behavior, which is unfortunate and not productive or not useful. If instead what your focus is not what's consistent with my identity, but what's consistent with my values, that allows you to reach outside who you think you are and instead try and let your integrity not be a function as much as as much your integrity is less a function of how consistent you are with your identity and therefore being honest with other people or in contexts that are social, and instead your authenticity, or not authenticity, integrity is a function of how consistent you are in aiming at your values with your behavior. And so your outcome, in terms of intentionality being outcome oriented, your outcome becomes having a process that is consistent with your values. And then your process, from an authenticity perspective, comes with either deciding or clarifying your values, depending on what your model of identity is. If your model doesn't let you decide, then you don't decide, you just clarify, and then you work with what you have. This reconciliation seems important. I don't think it's complete, but I'm not sure what it's missing. It always seems like there's some sort of cognitive dissonance pressure when you're trying to become stronger than what you think you currently are. And this dissonance isn't useful, but I believe it arises out of concerns regarding authenticity. So, reconciliation is what you want to move towards, and values so far seem to be the best way of reconciling, although it doesn't seem entirely complete. Anyways, it's not really a YouTube video if I don't say like, comment, or subscribe, I suppose. So pretend I said that in a way that wasn't self-referential. And hope this was informative.